the police commissioner, saying that the families of Jesse Baird and Luke Davies should be grateful to the man who allegedly murdered them for cooperating with police and revealing where their bodies were. Have a look.
This information did come with the assistance of the accused, for which we're very grateful, and I'm sure the families are very grateful.
These are callous remarks, and I'm going to discuss it in a minute with Bronwyn Bishop and Caleb Bond. We'll also get the latest on this case from our reporter who's live at the crime scene. Also ahead, companies that don't pay women fairly were today named and shamed, and it's about time. This horrific gender pay gap is coming from companies like Qantas that have been lecturing all of us about social issues. Well, we all know that men are better at fighting for higher pay than women, and it's time that these companies paid the genders fairly. Also tonight, Anthony Albanese is patronising towards Scott Morrison after he gives his farewell speech in Parliament. Their records are incomparable. But first tonight, well, there are 4 polls that now show the government in decline. With the latest, the Essential poll has the coalition leading for the first time since the election. The Guardian today reports that there's been a big hit to Anthony Albanese's trustworthiness, and it's a further cause for concern to the government. They say that just over a third, 37% of people, say that Albanese was trustworthy. This is now down 15 points from March last year. And then the number of respondents who said the PM was visionary was also down 12 points, just 34%. A majority of voters said that Albanese changes his opinion depending on who he thinks is listening. I'm sure that's something we'd all agree with. Others, 60%, say that he's out of touch with ordinary people, and 53% say he's narrow-minded. This follows the poor results for Albanese in Newspoll, The Resolve and Morgan. And it explains why the Prime Minister is starting to talk about the prospect of a massive swing against Labor in Dunkley. Labor holds the seat with a margin of 6.3%. So the PM's starting to talk about a 7% swing. He claims that it's normal in a by-election.
By-elections are tough for governments. We know that the average swing against a government in a government-held seat is around 7%. There's a 6.2% margin. There's a 7% average swing against governments in by-elections. That's just called science and maths, and that is just a fact.
He's said that comment about 5 times in the past couple of days, and it's a figure his ministers have repeated as well.
Oh, look, we always knew that the Dunkley by-election would be very close. As he said, this is a seat we hold by just over a 6% margin, and the average swing against a government in a by-election is 7%. So we're already behind the 8 ball.
If Labor had a 7% swing against it this Saturday in Dunkley, it would lose the seat. This would be a major victory for Peter Dutton. It could foreshadow a loss at the general election, and it would zap Albanese's confidence as PM. It could even put his leadership on the line. But most likely, the PM is putting this 7% figure out there so he can claim sweet success when the swing is only 5% and Labor managed to hold on to the seat. But by the way, the coalition says that a 7% swing is not normal for a by-election in a government-held seat. And Dennis Shanahan in The Australian reports today that the figure's actually on average 5.9%. And then in by-elections resulting from the death of a government MP, which is the situation in Dunkley, Shanahan says that the average swing against the government is just 2.6%. 2.6% compared to the 7% that Albanese has been claiming. But this just shows that clearly Labor's worried about a poor performance on Saturday after rising electricity prices, the cost of living crisis, the failed voice referendum, and now border security problems. Well, a new piece by The Australian's former editor-in-chief Christopher Dorr in The Nightly reveals that Albanese's confidants say he's tired, downbeat, emotional, and out of sorts as he embarks on his final year in office. A business leader describes him as agitated, And Dole reveals that the PM has taken to calling younger journalists and editors to express his displeasure at what they're writing and publishing. The piece also reveals that Labor operatives are really worried about the pool of scare campaigns that the coalition can now draw on. These now include ignoring the cost of living to run a failed voice referendum, the government letting rapists and murderers out onto the streets, the fact that boats are now arriving once again, the misinformation bill, which is so terrifying and dangerous, plus Albanese's broken promise after he insisted that his word is his bond. Also, we learn that Albanese apparently refers to his team as, get this, Albanistas, thinking they're all fans of his leadership. But Dore reports that behind a united public front, the Nightly has uncovered a barely dormant air of dismay, both with Albanese and his Albanistas, the left-wing cabal of like-minded and sycophantic advisors and MPs who run the government. In fact, as Labor insider Cameron Milner revealed here on this show last night, his own office apparently called the Prime Minister Yalbo for his temper behind his back.
He was losing staff all over the place. Some staff referred to him as Yelbo, not Albo.
Despite the poor polls and Albanese's many broken promises, the Prime Minister had the hide to criticise Scott Morrison today after his valedictory speech.
Not everything was perfect. Today's not a day to dwell on that. Today is a day to say that everyone went into those processes with good intentions, and I don't doubt for 1 second that that was the case.
So Albanese there, and he went on a bit about the good intentions, clearly criticising Morrison for his decisive leadership during the pandemic. I mean, sure, there were mistakes and wrong calls, but there was no rule book for this once-in-a-century pandemic. And Albanese himself has now ruled out a proper royal commission into the pandemic response, despite promising one in opposition. It means we're not going to learn the lessons for what to do differently next time that China unleashes a virus onto the world. This was the one day where Albanese could have been gracious towards Morrison for his time as Prime Minister and his stewardship during the pandemic, but he wasn't gracious or decent, he was patronising. Morrison has his critics, and you've heard them here on Sky News tonight, but he had the courage to confront China over its foreign influence and aggression in our region. He was responsible for AUKUS. He stood firmly with Israel. He continues to fight against anti-Semitism, and he was tough on border security. He stopped the boats. On most of these fronts, so far, Albanese has comprehensively failed. All right, joining me now, former Speaker of the House, Bronwyn Bishop, and Sky News host, Caleb Bond. Wonderful to see you both tonight.
Pleasure.
Look, we're going to come back to that topic of Scott Morrison and the polls with Albo in a minute, but I want to turn today to this gender pay gap reporting. This has been released for the first time. Companies have been named and shamed for their pay gap between men and women, some as large as 50%. Here are the top 10 companies when it comes to the pay gap, the worst companies. Let's have a look at this list here. You can see them there: Lorna Jane, Commonwealth Bank, Hunter Primary Care, Energizer, Jetstar owned by Qantas. Then you've got another list: Westpac, ANZ, BHP Group, Woodside Energy and NAB, the banks up there among them. Now, this report has been met with some hostility today, most famously from the likes of Matt Canavan. He said it's useless. Have a look.
It might be useless for its own objectives and purposes, but I worry it's actually counterproductive to our society. These type of reports are becoming annual Andrew Tate recruitment drives. All they do is spread division and resentment in our community. People, young men in particular, feel like they are now being discriminated against.
The idea that reporting on the pay gap between men and women would encourage men to turn to Andrew Tate is farcical. But Matt Canavan's colleague, Senator Jane Hume, pointed out that this list has shown the hypocrisy of companies who celebrate Women's Day. They go out there with cupcakes and morning tea, but then they fail to pay their female staff the same as men.
Some of those companies, and some of them that you named earlier on, make a big deal every year of International Women's Day, or they market their products to women, or they take active roles in social campaigns or political campaigns, and yet they perhaps haven't looked in their own backyard to see whether they really are meeting their own very high standards for others.
That was Jane Hume on Peter Credlin earlier. I think this reporting is absolutely essential. I've campaigned for it since I was editor of Clio magazine in 2013, 11 years ago. We all know the universal truth that men have more confidence when it comes to arguing for pay rises than women do. Bronwyn, look, I want to know what you think about this. You came up against the glass ceiling dramatically when you were starting out your political career.
Well, that's true, but I did manage to push on because I did a lot of firsts. But with regard to this report, there's an old adage, there's lies, damned lies and statistics. And the truth about this report is when you hear about it, you think, oh, that's about men and women not being paid the same for the same job. That's not what that report's about. That report is about saying that in a company which has 100 people or more, they have added up the amount of wages paid to the men and compared that with the total amount of wages paid to women. But they're different jobs within it. Now, the point that you're making there about men having more confidence to ask for pay rises and so almost take as an entitlement is quite right. But that's not this report. That's the one that says men and women are still not being paid the same for the same job. Now, I'll give you an example about what this one is about. In the Parliament, senators and members are all paid the same. But once you start up the ladder, getting a shadow ministry, a chairman of a committee, whatever, you're paid differently. And so I haven't done the actual stats, but I'll bet London to a brick that, in fact, you'll find that men are getting more money than women once you add all those packages up.
Yeah.
So it's important not to confuse the two issues.
I understand
and I
what
absolutely
you're saying.
agree with you, with women needing to learn tenacity and to stand up and say, no, I'm worth more, or I am worthy of this promotion, and being strong and confident in themselves. That's where there's still a lot lacking.
Look, it's true that this report doesn't compare women and men in the same jobs.
Correct.
But that's part of the problem, that there are more women in junior positions. That's why their pay is so vastly different, because these companies are still promoting the men, and no one on this planet could say that men deserve promotions more than women do, or that men are smarter than women, or that men deserve more money than women. That's not the case anymore.
No, I would never argue that, but I think there are also probably biological reasons behind this. I mean, if you look at childbirth, for instance, right, women tend to take more time out of work in order to look after their kids. We now have in this country paid parental leave from the state that is available to both parents if they want to take it. In the last financial year, 170,000 women took paid parental leave, 1,020 men did it. So these are decisions that are still being made by families, that they would prefer the woman, the mother, to stay at home after they've had a child. And things like that affect your income, your career progression, the superannuation that you earn, etc. So it's a noble aim that we should want women to have as much opportunity and as much income as men. But I think there are reasons behind that that mean it will never actually be achieved.
It's also a problem, though, that companies aren't promoting women after they've had children just because they can't do those inflexible hours.
But if you were allowed tax deductibility for childcare expenses, you would get a much better result. I did a whole inquiry into that, and I had professional women after professional women saying, if we could have this, we could have a fair competition in the workplace. But oh no, we've got to be levelled down. Everybody's got to put their child in an institution where they can teach it the institutional rubbish.
But also not everyone wants to put their child in childcare, and that's why we need flexible working hours and the ability to work from home while still getting promotions.
If we could finally get tax deductibility for childcare expenses, which I spent years trying to convince John Howard. It was like banging my head against a brick wall. But if we could actually achieve that, it would really make a difference for women.
All right, let's have a look at some of the other topics. I'd love to get both of your thoughts on what I spoke about in the editorial, the 4 polls that are now showing Anthony Albanese is going to struggle to win majority government at the next election. What do you think, Caleb?
Well, I'm still cackling at the concept of Albanistas. I can't believe he would dare to call them Albanistas. The successive polls we've seen over the last few days, and when you look at a news poll that came out on the weekend, which essentially showed, unlike the Guardian poll today, essentially showed they're in the same position as they were at the federal election, which is 32% primary and 52-48 on a two-party preferred basis. And then we hear the Prime Minister talking about this 7% swing that a government experiences in a by-election. Well, in the by-election they had in Aston last year, the government had a 6.3% swing towards it. So what they're really talking about now is we've gone from being able to gain 6.3% in a by-election to potentially losing up to 7% in a by-election. I think that tells the story as to where they're at.
Bronwyn, do you think the polls show that the public have made up their minds about the Prime Minister, or is it just a reflection of the bad couple of weeks he's had on border security?
No, I think they saw when he made the change to the stage 3 tax cuts, they took the money, but they recognise him for what he is, as Peter Dutton said, the liar in the lodge. And I think that resonates. The two things go parallel. And I think that's still growing in the community because you can't believe a word that man says. Every time he says, we will do something, you say, well, really? Are you thinking about changing that? So I think that's a very important thing. And, of course, when he says that border control is exactly the same as it was under the coalition, that's simply not true. It's just
no one believes it.
And
no
people
one believes
don't believe it.
Yeah.
So he's trying to hide his weakness. You notice whenever something is he wants to get away from, he'll say, well, it's the same as the coalition. But if it's something he's doing, oh, well, we inherited all this from the coalition.
Yes.
I mean, there's no responsibility taken by this government for being in government. They may as well stay in opposition.
What do you think about Scott Morrison's farewell speech today, Caleb? You know, obviously it was quite emotional. He made a lot of important points. There was even a light-hearted part where his daughters challenged him to mention, you know, Taylor Swift's albums and song lyrics. Actually, let's play that. Let's have a look at that because it was quite funny.
It is true that my political opponents have often made me see red. Often when subjected to the tortured poets who would rise to attack my reputation. In response, I always thought it important to be fearless and speak now, or forever hold my silence and allow those attacks to become folklore. Ever since leaving university in 1989, this has always been my approach.
Yeah, that was an impressive effort, but there were serious parts to the speech as well. Caleb, I've just been struck by how nasty everyone has been to Scott Morrison, the left and the right, absolutely smashing him. I mean, AUKUS, a very significant part of his legacy. Fine, there were a lot of bad calls during the pandemic, but most of those were from the States. The Prime Minister actually had decisive leadership. He made the country feel confident that he knew what he was doing. He had created the national cabinet. He stood up to China. He was a firm friend of Israel. He still fights against anti-Semitism. I think that whole Me Too movement with Brittany Higgins made a lot of the country dislike him, and that story is kind of unravelled now.
That might be part of it. Look, I will certainly give Morrison credit for AUKUS, and I will give him credit for being the first, essentially, in the world to start questioning the origins of COVID and taking on China in that regard. And we paid a heavy price for that, but it was the right thing to do at the time. But you bring up National Cabinet. I mean, National Cabinet was an absolute rabble. At no point did they come out of any of those meetings and then all go and do exactly what they agreed to?
That's
Victoria
not his
was
fault.
off.
That's
but the point of it, the point of it was silly. He backed the long border closures in places like Western Australia, which he did.
He did it. No, he didn't. He was trying to get them to open up.
No, but he repeatedly
100%
publicly
he was trying to get them to open up.
Repeatedly
publicly trying to get them to open up. No, he was publicly trying to get them to open the border.
Well, that's not my recollection. And I think in the end, what cost Morrison is that he seemed ingenuine. Now, whether that is fair or not, I think that became the perception, and in politics, perception is reality. I mean, we want to talk about Brittany Higgins. He publicly apologised to her in Parliament, almost as though it was an admission that something had happened. He should never have done that.
Bronwyn, how do you think the country will, in time, remember Scott Morrison?
In time, I think history will be kinder to him than we are now, because so much of what Caleb said is just spot on. The thing that I think I find difficult was when he surrendered to the lobby and said we'd go for nil emissions by 2050. Now, if he'd been really cued in, if he had had an election in November, instead of worrying about all that stuff, I think he would have won. So I think he lost his way there after the creation of the cabinet. But AUKUS, I can't tell you, is so important. Having the courage to cancel the French submarines and the way he handled the negotiations with both Britain and the United States will be really quite remarkable in history's eyes. And that will be very important, as I think some of the policies with regard to COVID will be seen as good. Not the huge expenditure of money when big firms got money they were never entitled to pay back, or elevating the premiers, who most people had never heard of, to being his equal when the Prime Ministership is above the state premiers. So all those things, I think, over time will become less important, and AUKUS itself will become the dominant memory of the Morrison government.
The lasting legacy. Bronwyn Bishop, Caleb Bond, thank you both so much. Caleb, we'll see you 10 o'clock tonight. Now, after the break, veteran gay rights campaigner Karen Phelps would join me. She disagrees with the decision of the Mardi Gras to stop police in uniform from marching. Also, a major development in the Sydney double murder investigation. We're live with our reporter at the crime scene next. Welcome back. Well, a major development in the Sydney double murder investigation, with police today confirming that they discovered the two bodies of Jessie Baird and Luke Davies. New South Wales Police Commissioner Karen Webb addressed the media this afternoon. She said the search and the find was an important day in the investigation. But then she made a highly offensive remark. She said that the families of Luke and Jessie should be grateful, and that's the word she used, grateful, to the alleged murderer for cooperating. Have a look.
I'd like to say also that this information did come with the assistance of the accused, for which we're very grateful, and I'm sure the families are very grateful.
Unbelievable choice of words. I think that's utterly callous. No one is grateful to an alleged murderer for cooperating with police. It is shocking. Just the latest in many bungles from this New South Wales Police Commissioner. Now, Sky News senior reporter Fiona Willan has been following this story, and she joins me live now. Fiona, take us through this extraordinary development today.
Well, Sharri, it's been just over a week since Jessie and Luke vanished from the house behind me, and tonight, finally some answers for their families, because police believe they've set up a crime scene and they believe that they have found the bodies. So they've found this has happened at a property at Bungonia, which is near Goulburn. It's about 20 minutes away from another property that was being searched yesterday. This afternoon, officers found human remains in surfboard bags. They were sitting along the fence line of the property and they were covered in debris. Nevertheless, police are confident this is the missing couple. So they went to that property this afternoon after earlier in the day, around 11 a.m, going to visit the accused in jail. They say that Bola Marcondon gave them information that led to the bodies. And this is what officers had to say as they announced the news today.
Well, the first phone call was to the families to let them know. They've had support from a family liaison officer, who's another detective on the investigation, who's been providing that support, and they were informed straight away. And again, it's probably mixed emotions for them, and you can understand how they may have felt, but at least they have an answer, and they want to travel down to the Goulburn area, and we'll provide as much support as we can and accommodate them.
Now, as you can see, the house behind me has been transformed into a makeshift memorial. We have seen friends and strangers stopping by this evening to pay their respects. Sharri?
All right, Fiona, thank you so much for that update. Now, we also learnt today that Mardi Gras organisers uninvited police from marching in the gay and lesbian Mardi Gras parade that's this weekend. This because Jesse Baird and Luke Davies were allegedly killed at the hands of a police officer, Beau Lamar Condon, using his official police weapon. There are now negotiations to see if perhaps police who aren't in uniform can join the Mardi Gras, but a final agreement hasn't yet been reached. Joining me to discuss this is, she's a famous doctor, but she's also a veteran gay rights campaigner, Dr. Professor Karen Phelps. Karen, thank you so much for joining me. Look, this comes after the Sydney Morning Herald published an editorial just yesterday calling for the police not to march in this year's Mardi Gras. That was kind of an unusual call, but then today, just this morning, we hear the decision that Mardi Gras organisers had told police they weren't welcome. Now, of course, this does follow a very long and difficult history where New South Wales Police have treated the gay and lesbian community poorly. But what do you think of this decision?
Well, Sharri, I strongly disagree with this decision by Mardi Gras. I think it's something that is short-sighted, and I don't think it has really taken into consideration the longer history between the New South Wales Police and the LGBTQI plus community and the efforts that have gone into improving that relationship. Now, as you've said, there's been a very difficult history between the LGBTQI plus community and the New South Wales Police, going way back to when homosexuality was illegal, when careers and personal lives were destroyed by criminal convictions. And just recently, the New South Wales Special Commission of Inquiry into LGBTIQ hate crimes over a 40-year period was released, and that makes for some very sobering reading. Very distressing elements to that, and it showed that there's still work to be done, and in a number of areas, and that I'd like to certainly see all of those recommendations of the report to be implemented in full. And then, of course, the 1978 protesters in Sydney, and they were met by violence by the New South Wales Police, and that sparked the first Mardi Gras parade. And it took many years for an apology from police, but that did eventually came. And so over the years, New South Wales Police have made progress in improving that relationship, and I just think this is a backward step.
I mean, I understand that you were personally at one of the first Mardi Gras parades when police officers were given approval to march in uniform for the first time. Look, even that was a big step. And, it seems that, not just this, but in life at the moment, it seems that there's so much division in our society, and that Mardi Gras is the one event that is inclusive of everyone, and that excluding police officers, and there would be presumably a lot of gay and lesbian police officers in the force who would have been looking forward to participating in the Mardi Gras. So, what do you think of this element to it as well?
It was a big deal for police to march in the 1998 Mardi Gras parade. It's a big deal even today for them to make that decision to march in uniform in the Mardi Gras parade. And that visibility is so very important to those individual police officers, to the police force as a whole, for them to see that they have colleagues who are not only supportive of the LGBTQI plus community, but that their colleagues are members of the LGBTQI plus community. It also is a sign of mutual trust and respect for the police to march. Now, as you said, Jackie and I were there at the 1998 Mardi Gras parade. We'd just recently been outed. At the time, it was a very anxiety-provoking thing to either out yourself or be outed by media at the time. And so I know what it took for those police officers to have the courage to march in uniform at that point. Now, a lot of people today who take a lot of those rights that have been hard fought don't really appreciate what that took. And it still is an act of courage and visibility for New South Wales police officers to don the uniform and to turn up at the parade.
I remember
saying that we also expect New South Wales Police to keep order at the parade and to keep people safe. So I think building bridges at this time of so much disharmony in the community is a very important thing.
Look, this has all come out of the perception that the murders, the double murders of Jesse and Luke, had to do with the police. And, you know, I think, and while the police commissioner has announced a review into, you know, the accessibility of weapons and various aspects, ultimately this was a double murder by a single police officer who knew one of the men.
This is a tragic loss of two young men, Jesse Baird and Luke Davies, and my sympathies, my deepest sympathies go to their family and to their friends. And there is a lot of pain being experienced in the local community around Paddington and the broader LGBTQI plus community about the murder of these two young men. And you know, that pain is not going to be solved by excluding the police, who are doing their very best to solve this double murder and to bring the alleged perpetrator to justice. And I just think that the issues are being conflated in a way that's not helpful for community harmony.
Yeah. All right. Professor Karen Phelps, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Now, coming up, the Palestinian Authority government resigns after mounting international pressure. I'm going to discuss this with Liberal MP Julian Leeser. He's also going to give his verdict on Scott Morrison, and I tell you, he disagrees with all the bullying of the former PM. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, major news overnight in the Middle East, with the Palestinian Authority government resigning on Monday. The move hailed a success, or a step forward at least, by the US, who want a reformed Palestinian Authority to govern Gaza instead of Hamas when the war is over. Joining me now, Liberal MP Julian Leeser. Thank you so much for your time. Look, this is
Sharri.
Significant news. I mean, the President, Mahmoud Abbas, hasn't resigned. There's no indication he's going anywhere. There hasn't been a presidential election since 2005. So why this move to have the Palestinian Authority government resign?
Well, I think the Palestinian Authority government has lacked a certain legitimacy. As you say, there hasn't been a presidential election for nearly 20 years. There are not regular elections there in the Palestinian Authority more broadly. And I think the general view is that if there were elections, that Hamas would actually take over in the West Bank, as well as they had run Gaza. And so that's not in really anybody's interest, least of all the Palestinian people. But the Palestinian Authority has failed to deliver for their own people. It's widely regarded as corrupt and ineffective. And the US have been talking about them having a role in Gaza post the conflict, and that this being a precondition. Whether they will or not, that will all be a matter that is still subject to negotiation. And as long as Hamas is running around, as long as it continues to want to drive Israel out of existence, not just Israel, but Jews more broadly, as long as it maintains its weapons system and as long as it refuses to surrender, the war will continue in Gaza.
Yeah. The Albanese government is being urged to stop a pro-Palestinian activist who's described Hamas terrorists as freedom fighters from being given an Australian visa. This is Layla Khaled. She's hijacked not one but two planes. She's part of the terror group, the PFLP. It's hard to believe any event organisers would want her to come to Australia. Look, Julian, there's freedom of speech and then there's hate speech, and surely the government has to step in and stop this visa being issued.
Sharri, this should be the easiest decision Andrew Giles has ever made, because why would we give a visa to somebody who's been a multiple aeroplane hijacker, who's coming to Australia to promote a range of views that are well outside the mainstream and may well be inciting behaviour here. But I'll tell you something that this all tells you about, and that is what is happening in the far left of Australian politics, in the sewers in which the Green Party swim. And this is, you've got these people on the far left who are calling for noted terrorists and hijackers to come and address them. That says that there's a real sickness there. As I've said previously, anti-Semitism has become almost an ideology in the far left of politics and among the Greens. And I want to see people like Adam Bandt actually calling out this conference. Instead, I think you'll see him and his acolytes embracing it. It's not just enough to not grant this person a visa. I think the government needs to look at what role the E-Safety Commissioner can play, what role the Minister for Communications and the Minister for Home Affairs can play in the event that she's not granted a visa and she spews her hate virtually from some location overseas. This shouldn't be allowed to happen in Australia, not in 2024. This is not the country we know and love.
Yeah, especially when we've got anti-Semitism exploding and a lack of social cohesion on the streets and so many incidents and attacks and even physical aggression.
You're right, Sharri, but I don't think there's time for this at any time, frankly. I mean, I think that the left are on the far left here are on a frolic, and it's a dangerous frolic, and it's a frolic that is flirting with the most extreme people on the planet here, people who are noted hijackers, noted terrorists, and they're trying to bring these people to Australia to talk to Australians. I think that's a really bad development.
No, I completely agree. Now, just quickly before you go, I want to ask you about former Prime Minister Scott Morrison. He gave his valedictory speech today. It's kind of been difficult, I think, for someone who has served this country for I don't know his exact period as an MP, but for decades in Parliament, thank you, 16 years, to hear how people have just smashed him one after the other, even on this channel tonight. What do you think?
Well, I'm proud of Scott Morrison. I'm proud to call him a friend. I think every Liberal should be proud of him. This is the bloke that stopped the boats. This is the bloke that stopped us getting Bill Shorten as Prime Minister. Shorten is a man who has never seen a tax rise he didn't love. This is a man who basically transformed Australia's relationship with the world. There's been a lot of talk on the program already about the importance of AUKUS, and it will be important. But it's not just AUKUS. It's also the relationship with India, bringing India into the Quad, the extraordinary trade agreement that we got that's providing opportunities for Australians and Indians like never before. As you've pointed out, his steadfastness on Israel and also his steadfastness on Ukraine too. If Scott Morrison were Prime Minister, you can bet your bottom dollar we would be sending the Taipan helicopters to Ukraine today. And as a Prime Minister domestically, he had the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. He steered us through the pandemic and he did a great job. I mean, you think about how few people in this country died compared to so many of our other similar allies around the world. You think about the way in which the economy rebounded. I think this is a bloke who can hold his head high, and I'm sick of seeing the obsession of Anthony Albanese and the Labor Party with him. I'd rather Albanese spend some time looking forward to the future rather than back to the past. And there shouldn't be Liberals criticising somebody who I think will be regarded as among the first rank of Liberal Prime Ministers.
There you go. Very strong defence of Scott Morrison there. Julian Leeser, thank you very much for joining me this evening. Now, confidential Treasury analysis seen by the Fin Review, obtained under Freedom of Information, shows that high wages growth was actually the biggest driver of inflation in the June quarter last year. So much for profit gouging. Joining me now to discuss is macro business chief economist Leith Van Onselen. Leith, look, this is different from the regular message we're hearing from the government about what's keeping and what's made inflation so high. But it's so interesting that the Fin Review had to obtain this under FOI.
Yeah, look, I'll be honest, Sharri, I think the Treasury's actually got it wrong here. Look, Australian wages only grew by 0.1% more than headline inflation last year, and they're actually in line with underlying inflation. And it's important to note that Australia's wage growth is actually among the slowest in the developed world. So it's actually below the US, the UK and the Eurozone. And also Australian real wages, that's after you adjust for inflation, are tracking at around 2010 levels after falling about nearly 7% from that peak. So I think it's wrong for the Australian Treasury to claim that wages are driving inflation when real wages actually fallen so sharply. That said, if wage growth does continue to strengthen from here, I think we could have a problem, and then that could start feeding into inflation. But I think that outcome's actually pretty unlikely, because we've obviously got rising unemployment now and the labour market's weakening. So I think wage growth's actually going to slow anyway. So I don't agree with the Treasury on this analysis, I've got to say.
That's really interesting. So the Treasury clearly saying here that high wages growth, which has pushed the average full-time pay, they're saying over $100,000. They're saying this is the biggest driver of CPI, of inflation, into the year until June 2023. So, the government's line has been, and Jim Chalmers has been very successful in saying that he's getting wages growth moving again. It had been sluggish for well over the past decade. But you're actually saying that Treasury's got it wrong here. Why do you think the officials, why do you say that? Do you think Treasury isn't as credible as it once was?
No, it's absolutely not as credible. I mean, if this is the sort of garbage they're going to put out, they're completely talking through their backsides. I've got to be quite frank. And that's that full-time average earnings figure. If you actually look at ordinary average earnings, so that's not just full-time, that's part-time as well. That only went up 3.9% in the year, which was actually below inflation. So the fact of the matter is, Australian workers have seen their wages after inflation fall massively, nearly 7% from their peak. And they're tracking at 2010 levels. So they've gone backwards at a severe rate of knots. So for the Treasury then say that they're now responsible for inflation is appalling analysis. It's completely wrong. And I think it's there to distract from other issues, which I like to call elbow inflation, which is basically high energy inflation because we've got broken energy policy in this country, as well as obviously high housing inflation because the Albanese government's driving immigration through the moon, and it's basically driving up things like rents, which is pushing up inflation. So I think Treasury's just trying to basically distract here to bring heat away from the government, perhaps. I'm not sure what their motivation is, but it's definitely factually incorrect.
Very interesting. Now, just before you go, Australia has been warned by the United Nations that unless it adopts a climate-forward economic reform agenda, we're going to end up having entire populations trying to move to Australia. They're saying this is climate change migration. You've spoken a lot about immigration and the impact it's had on the economy, both positive and negative. What do you think of this warning from the UN?
Look, I don't know why they're going after Australia. I mean, I'll be quite honest. If Australia reduced its carbon emissions to zero tomorrow, it wouldn't move the needle globally at all. We're a tiny player in the world stage. And I think, shouldn't the UN be lecturing huge emitters like China, where emissions are, way larger than Australia's and they're growing almost exponentially, rather than Australia, where emissions are pretty flat. And once you, adjust for population growth, they're actually falling. So, I think the UN's targeting the wrong country here. That's my opinion, Sharri.
What a surprise, yet another global body failing to go after China. We saw it during COVID with the World Health Organization as well. Leith Van Onselen, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Now, still to come, leaked documents reveal what seems to be a hackers for hire scheme with links to the Chinese government. More on that with a former Intel officer in a minute. Well, finally tonight, there's been an extraordinary leak of a trove of documents that claims to catalogue hacking activity and tools to spy on Chinese and foreigners. This from a private security firm that's linked to the Chinese government and its Ministry of State Security. There are even claims that NATO has been targeted with discussions about hacking the organisation, also discussions about hacking Twitter and downloading DMs, direct messages. According to Associated Press, this leak reveals the methods used by Chinese authorities to surveil dissidents overseas, hack other nations, and promote pro-Beijing narratives on social media. It's unbelievable. One cyber expert who's been analysing this leak in detail is former Australian Army intelligence officer and co-founder of Internet 2.0, a cybersecurity company, David Robinson. And David joins me now. Look, we don't know who actually leaked this data, but it's caused a major stir on a global scale. David, what are the main things that we've learned about how the Chinese conduct hacking?
Good evening, Sharri. So from this leak, we can see that the Chinese government, I assume, that was in the leak, basically have a strong capability and intent to target international organisations, international governments and corporations around the world. They have large-scale automated hacking platforms that they sell the software to their clients. They talk daily about hacking other organisations and people, and they have a huge number of victims, a huge long list of people that they've hacked in the last 7 to 10 years.
So when we talk about state-sponsored hacking, the culprits are usually China and Russia. Is this how China would, get private companies? We know it's been linked to the MSS, the Ministry for State Security, to actually hack other nations. And I know that there's also discussion of payments in there. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
So the Chinese government and also this company have really got their pants, they've been pulled their pants down really in terms of embarrassment. The entire document really indicts and implies and shows that the Chinese government supports this broad-scale hacking. So there are a lot of contracts between the Ministry of Public Security and this company. They have open letters of support from CCP organisations because they're a company there in Chengdu and they're operating as a normal company. But in the background, 2/3 of their staff are conducting APT hacking operations, and they're selling this data and access to all their clients.
The other interesting part of this is what I mentioned a minute ago from the Associated Press article, that among the discussion is also how to promote pro-Beijing narratives, propaganda on social media. How does this play into it?
So they had a document basically outlining one of their strategic capabilities and software platforms, which was designed to surveil, monitor and create large-scale groups of accounts, basically, to influence people on Twitter, and it was targeted specifically at Twitter. This is a normal type of software in the world of cybersecurity because everyone is looking at, scraping Twitter and looking at Twitter, but the intent of the software is different. It's built to create accounts, influence chat organizations, influence the narrative, but also send phishing links to people. So this platform is enabling you to use the platform to identify groups, dissidents, or anyone talking about what's interested to the user, and then sending phishing links to basically take over their accounts. And they specifically talk about deleting those accounts through the software once you've taken over it.
You also pulled up the discussion about hacking NATO, where the users or these people were discussing whether or not to hack NATO. What do we know about this?
Some of the users in the company, basically the entire internal chat logs of the company have been leaked. So there's tens and thousands, hundreds of thousands of lines that we're pulling and trawling through the data. But some of the users have talked about openly, should we hack NATO? Can we sell this NATO data? The client already has the NATO data, how do we make a profit out of this? And they're talking specifically about NATO and also the boss of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg.
This is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, I think people don't understand the scale of this. We know China and we know Russia are responsible for major hacks globally, but, to have this leak, to have a state-sponsored company that does the hacking, their chats leaked for everyone to see. It should really be a bigger story. I'm sure people watching tonight wouldn't have heard of it. Until right now, it should be a major global story. David Robertson, thank you so much for examining it so closely and bringing it to my attention. And that's all we've got time for tonight. Thank you so much for your company. Stay tuned. Paul Murray's here with another amazing show. That's it from me. I'll see you tomorrow at 8 p.m.